Thank you so much, everyone, for voting for that. I'm now going to hand over to Sophie Ledger, who, as I mentioned, is the Living Planet Report Fellow. I'm going to bring her up here so you can all see her. Sophie, I'm going to let you kick off the presentations this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Just gonna hope this was going to work. Here we go. Hopefully everyone can see my presentation. Thank you so much for the introduction, Charlotte. Yep, so I'm Sophie Ledger and I'm Living Planet Report Fellow here at ZSL. I work with the Living Planet Index team at the Institute of Zoology, and I also work with the editorial team over at WWF on the production and finalisation of Living Planet Report 2020. So in my presentation, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the reports and introduce some of the key themes, and then hand over to my colleagues for a deeper look into some of the analysis that features. So what is the Living Planet Report? It's WWF's flagship publication, and it's published every 2 years since 1998. It was originally created as a communication tool for trends in biodiversity, but it has since then expanded and evolved and become a more comprehensive study of trends in global biodiversity and in the health of the planet. And ZSL has featured quite greatly in this. So since 2006, we were a principal research partner on the report, which is when the report began to have more scientific content and more of a research focus. So one of the key research contributions of ZSL to the LPR is the Living Planet Index, or LPI, and that's the Living Planet Report's headline indicator. And Louise is going to go into that into more detail on that in her presentation, so I won't talk too much about this. So I mentioned the expansion of the Living Planet reports. Well, they're actually known as a family now for the 2020 edition. It comprises of 6 separate reports. You have the summary report, the core report, a deep dive into freshwater, a deep dive into biodiversity in a warming world, a deep dive into the Living Planet Index itself, and finally the Voices for a Living Planet, which is a series of essays from around the world, and it even features an essay by Sir David Attenborough. So that's well worth a look, I think. So to create all of this content, we've worked with 134 authors, and they all hail from 31 countries across the world, almost every continent, just not Antarctica this year. From 78 universities, institutions, and conservation organizations. And these authors, they're experts who are drawn from across research, policy, and practice, and they include some kind of notable names, such as Sir Bob Watson, who's the IPBES chair, and IPBES co-chairs Sandra Diaz and Patricia Balvanera, as well as Dominic Warray of the World Economic Forum, and Sir Partha Dasgupta, who's leading the Descriptor Review for Her Majesty's Treasury, as well as some familiar names from ZSL as well. So the aims of the report itself is to be a scientific springboard, bringing together the latest research and our best collective understanding about what we know about global biodiversity, how we measure it, and how we can use that knowledge to shape the future. So the report and the LPI themselves are a valuable tool for policy, and Louise is going to talk a bit more about that later again. So to support this, it was timed to be launched just a few days ahead of the 5th Global Biodiversity Outlook report, and just ahead of the United Nations General Assembly, where the global leaders were expected to review progress made to date on Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. So impact-wise, the report was launched on the 10th of September, and I think considering all the disruptions of COVID, etc., and everything all the different authors and experts were dealing with, I think it's really commendable that we kept to time and delivered on track. So we estimate over 2 days, since the report was launched just 2 days, It generated 448 news articles and reached more than 76 million people around the world. And to support broader global reach, the summary report was translated into over 20 languages. And then coming back to sort of the other notable policy uses, the 2020 Global Living Planet Index and Cells research features in the Global Biodiversity Outlook report that I mentioned just now. And it's also proposed to be included in the Gupta review, which is an independent global review on the economics of biodiversity. So the Living Planet Report 2020 is an edition of firsts. It's the first to include a specific deep dive on the state of fresh water and on the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. And as I mentioned before, there's also a specific section called The Voices from a Living Planet, and that's a series of essays from global thinkers and practitioners. And within the core report itself, and the pictures on the slide cover each of the main chapters within the core report, we have a number of firsts. So previously, the report was quite vertebrate focused, but in this edition, I'm really happy about this personally. We have sections dedicated to the state of plants and to highlight the plight of invertebrates, and also to raise awareness on the lack of data in tropical regions as well. And in terms of the Living Planet Index analysis, we have the headline global LPI indicator as usual, but we also see more regional analysis, a specific freshwater LPI, an LPI for reptiles, and also for European grassland species. So on to the key messages. Well, it's quite a stark message, but there is no future without a fundamental shift in how humanity values nature. We know that nature is essential for human existence and that our activities and actions are driving biodiversity loss. Since 1970, the total gross domestic product, or GDP, has increased 4 times. The extraction of living materials from nature has tripled, and in total, the global human population has doubled, along with an enormous trend towards urbanization. And our values underpin how we act at a societal level, which defines the way human activities are undertaken en masse and consequently our impact on nature. So we see that the main causes of biodiversity loss on land are habitat loss and degradation, and within the oceans it's overexploitation. And these are all kind of largely driven by how we produce our food. And our lifestyles demand 1.56 times more than what the Earth can give us. So this is using ecological footprint analysis, which Robin will talk about in more detail in his presentation. But humanity is over-consuming the Earth's resources quicker than the Earth can regenerate. And when we look at the breakdown of humanity's ecological footprint by activities and by land use, the top users of the Earth's resources again relate to food production and land use. So you can see on the chart to the left side, when you look at the ecological footprint by activities, 29% is due to food, and then 25% is housing. So it's quite a clear picture coming across from this research. So what impact is this having upon global wildlife populations? Well, we can look at the trends in abundance of species populations from around the world using the Living Planet Index. And the main result for this, the Global LPI 2020, shows that between 1970 and 2016, there was an average decline of population sizes of monitored vertebrates by 68%, which is quite a striking figure. And this analysis is based on 20,811 populations of 4,392 species of mammals, birds, amphibians, fish, and reptiles. And I'm going to hand it over to, oops, sorry, pardon me, there we go, skipping backwards. I'm actually going to hand over to Louise, who's going to explore the LPI in more detail and highlight the different LPI analysis that feature within this report. So thank you so much for listening, and another thank you again to all of my amazing colleagues at ZSL and all the contributors and authors as well.
Great, thank you, Sophie. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening to hear our presentations. I'm just going to start my presentation up. Okay. I want to give you a little bit more information on the Living Planet Index, which, as Sophie said, is the headline indicator from the Living Planet report. It's been a feature of the report since the series began in the late 1990s, and ZSL have led the development of the indicator since 2006 in partnership with WWF. I'll talk a little bit about what the indicator is, how we calculate it, and also some of the applications of both the data and the method beyond the Living Planet report. So the building blocks of the Living Planet Index, or I'll just say LPI for short, are population trends. These are population trends from vertebrate species, so birds, mammals, fish, reptiles and amphibians. And by a population, what we mean is it is a particular species monitored at a defined location consistently over at least 2 years. And these data can be collected in the field anywhere in the world or the sea, and using a variety of different methods depending on what type of species or what type of location it is. So this can be anything like camera trapping in some remote locations, satellite monitoring, for example, and some of our marine fish, we get data from stock assessments of commercial species. It's quite a wide variety of methods and sources that we get our data from. And then after being collected in the field, these data are analysed, processed, published in things like scientific papers, in reports, and in online databases. And this is where the ZSL team come in. So we scour these resources and look for suitable data that we can feed into the index. And so we process this data. There can be different sorts of trends. Some are increasing, some are declining, some are fluctuating or just staying roughly stable. And then in order to calculate the index, we use what is called a generalized additive modeling. And this framework allows us to look at the long-term trends and capture those long-term trends in populations. And what we do is then we average these trends to produce the global LPI. Now, as I mentioned, we do collect data from everywhere in the world. We have data from all continents and all oceans. And data collection is a continual process, so we never stop trying to augment the database behind the LPI. And as you can see on this map, the yellow dots show you where we've added new species in the last couple of years, and the orange ones show you where we've added new populations in the last couple of years. So this has been a continual process. And as you can also see from this map, though, we do have some gaps geographically, but also taxonomically as well. So notably in many tropical regions, you can see that which are very high in biodiversity. So we tend to have clusters of data in North America, in Europe, in Eastern and Southern Africa, and in the Indian subcontinent. But as you can see, there are some gaps, so we don't have comprehensive coverage of data all across the world. Now, in order to address this imbalance in data, when we calculate the global LPI, we use a weighted average. Otherwise, we would have an index that is skewed by where the areas and the species for which we have most data. So we use this weighted average in order to try and get a better picture of what is happening to vertebrate populations. So we place greater weight on species groups and regions where biodiversity is highest. So as an example, the vertebrate biodiversity in neotropical regions, so that's roughly Latin America, and that's highest in vertebrate species richness. So this means that this region gets more weight in the index than other regions. And this gives us our global figure, which Sophie has already reported on, which shows an average decline of 68% between 1970 and 2016 in these monitored populations. Now, as we can see, this shows an average decline, but actually we don't see declines everywhere in all species and all populations, and that was just an average. And in fact, this figure shows for each taxonomic group, shows you the percentage of species trends that show an average increase in blue and the average decline in the orange, or a stable trend in the green. And as you can see, more or less, there's about a 50-50 split between the increases and the declines, with the exception of the amphibians, where you can see we've got almost a 62% of amphibian species are showing an average decline. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide as to why that is. So I'll now talk about some of the more thematic disaggregations of the data. So aside from the global LPI, what else have we been able to establish in terms of trends in vertebrates? Well, we found that freshwater populations showed the starkest decline. So this was an average change of 84% between 1970 and 2016 for these freshwater populations. Now, to put that in context, over a similar time period, the freshwater habitats such as wetlands have also been in decline. So coastal wetlands have declined by 39% and inland wetlands by an average of 35% in extent over that same time period. And there's also been a transformation of river systems, and actually some of the longest, only a third of the longest rivers are actually continue to be free flowing, so they haven't been impeded by things like dam construction. And I've just highlighted 3 groups of species that have been particularly impacted in freshwater systems. One is Megafauna. These are species that are over 30 kilograms in weight. And these are particularly impacted by things like overexploitation. Migratory fish. Now, the main threat to migratory fish is habitat change and largely the fragmentation of river systems, often due to dam construction. The migratory fish rely on having these routes so they can swim through the river systems to reach their spawning grounds. And if there is a barrier which is impeding that route, then that will have ramifications on their ability to reproduce and survive. And then finally, amphibians, which I mentioned on the previous slide. Now, amphibians, one of the 2 biggest threats to amphibians are habitat loss and degradation, but also fungal disease is impacting many species worldwide. And this fungal disease is called chytrid, and the impact of this disease is often quite catastrophic on local populations, so it can actually cause rapid population decline and sometimes local extinctions as well. In the Living Planet report, we also featured our first in-depth look into a taxonomic group, so this was reptiles. We focused on reptiles really because this is actually the group that we've got least data for, and so we wanted to make a concerted effort to see if we could collect more data and to see if we could see what is happening in reptile populations. We still found that most data we have are for crocodiles, turtles and tortoises. These tend to be more popular species and also commercial species groups, so they tend to be better monitored. And we found the main threats to these populations are habitat loss and overexploitation. And the average trend in these populations was 31%, which is not as striking as some of the other results, but still, it still shows an average decline. And we also used some other research by ZSL scientists, which used a measure of extinction risk and tried to assess how susceptible reptiles might be to climate change. Because at the moment, climate change is not one of the major current threats to these species, but it was found that actually 80% of reptile species have been assessed as highly sensitive to the predicted temperature and rainfall changes. So it's something that may become a bigger threat over time. And as you may well be aware, that by focusing just on vertebrates in the LPI, we're only looking at trends in 5% of animal species. And so we can't say anything about invertebrates. But this is obviously a big missing picture from biodiversity and from animal species in general. So what can we say about insects, which represent 80% of animal species? And this was one of the first that Sophie mentioned in the report. Well, this map shows the location of 103 studies looking at changes in abundance and biomass of insects. And you can see that there's a mixed pattern. There are some decreases in the red and increases in the blue, but you can also see that it suffers from some of the same biases that we've seen in the vertebrate data, which is clusters of data in North America and in Europe. So we're really lacking a global picture in what is happening to insects. And you can also see from the bar graph at the bottom there that also we don't have a lot of long-term monitoring data, so we don't have a lot of historical data. And particularly so, we're just generally lacking a lot of data in tropical regions in general. So what we did for the report was we focused on one of the better studied insect groups, which are the butterflies, which have been very well monitored, for example, in Europe. And this index shows the trend in European grassland butterflies between 1990 and 2017. And this was 17 species of grassland butterfly species, and they declined on average by 49%. And that's largely due to agricultural intensification. And one of the final thematic indices I'll show you is the Forest Specialist Index. And this came from some recent research that was published this year. And we wanted to look at forest specialists. And these are species that rely entirely on the forest habitat for their survival. These species often tend to be quite important in ecosystem functions, so they might perform services such as pollination, seed dispersal and herbivory. So in turn, as we're seeing here, that we're seeing a decline in these populations on average of 53%. And this in turn could have ramifications on the forest habitat itself because these species are carrying out these vital roles. We also found by doing this research that actually when we look at one of the indicators that's often used to monitor the health of forests, tree cover or forest cover, we don't always find that correlates with the population trends that we saw of the wildlife. And so we were suggesting that actually along in parallel with these forest cover or tree cover indicators, we do need this indicator of wildlife, which may be impacted by things such as exploitation. So we can't always tell what's happening below the canopy just by measuring the trends in tree cover. And this new indicator has been used in the State of the World's Forest Report in 2020, and it's also been proposed as one of the new indicators for the post-2020 targets as well. And finally, I just wanted to mention some other uses of the LPI. So beyond the Living Planet report, this indicator has been used widely in policy. It was adopted by the Convention on Biological Diversity as one of the key global biodiversity indicators, measuring progress towards the 2010 target and more recently the 2020 targets. And it's also been featured in many of the global biodiversity assessments as well that have been published by IPBES, and the UN's reports, the Global Biodiversity Outlook and Global Environment Outlook as well. So it features in many of these key policy assessments and is also expected to be one of the key indicators that will be used post-2020 as well. And the database that sits behind the index is continually growing, and it's a really valuable resource beyond just the indicator. So it's been used a lot in research as well. The word cloud just shows you some of the subjects that have been tackled using the underlying data from the publications that have come out of the index. And we've looked at themes such as regional and taxonomic trends. We've also tried to assess the impact of conservation on populations and the impact of threats on different populations as well. We've also measured progress towards policy targets, and it's been a useful tool for education and training. So for many undergraduate and postgraduate students, they've been using the data, the method, and beyond students as well, many other researchers have been using the data. The bar graph at the bottom shows the increase in the number of citations of the LPI data and the method that have happened over time as well. So the impact is growing on here, and it's important to keep the database growing, not just for the indicator itself, but for its value in research and conservation in general. And so I'll now hand over to Robin, who's going to talk to you more about the Living Planet report in detail and some of our more recent research.
Thanks, Louise. Let's see if I can switch to my screen. There we go. So hopefully everyone can see that title slide. So as Louise and Sophie mentioned, the Living Planet report this year is a report of firsts. And one of the last things that I'd like to talk about, which comprises the kind of fourth chapter of this report, is our attempt to look at what might happen in the future. And so what Louise mentioned was that the Living Planet Index is comprised of this very large data set that we've been collecting for over 10 years. And that comprises over 20,000 populations of over 4,000 species. And that data set is invaluable not just in the production of the Living Planet Index, but also in some of these other thematic indices that Louise mentioned. And so these are indices like the Forest Specialist Index or the Reptile Living Planet Index, which represent papers that we've published as ZSL, but are also then included in the report and then also feed into policy. And some of the other bits of research that we might undertake are things like this. This is a paper we had just last year where we looked at whether population trends in developing countries correlated well with some of the other sustainable development goal indicators for those countries. And I'm not going to go into this in detail, but just to highlight things like this seemed to suggest that population trends were able to increase better in places where there was better GDP increases, but declined worse in places where human population density increased. And all I wanted to highlight with this was this idea that this database that we've been able to collect allows us to ask increasingly interesting questions about how that relates to human development and economic development. Another thing that we published a couple of years ago was a model that tried to ask the question about whether land use change, so how different parts of human landscapes might impact populations, compared to climate warming, so how rapid the climate has warmed, how those two factors those two threats might impact wildlife populations, in particular here of birds and mammals. And what was surprising here is that we found that the rate of climate warming was a better predictor of bird in particular, but also mammal trends than land use. Now this is ongoing work, and so we think that it might be historical land use changes that have impacted mammals worse and more recent warming that's impacting birds. But what's interesting here is this kind of model where we're able to compare land use and climate to wildlife populations gives us the beginning of something where we can ask questions about how those different changes in the future might affect biodiversity. And so biodiversity loss is something that's increasingly highlighted as a risk to human well-being. So this is a survey called the Global Risk Perception Survey that was highlighted in the Living Planet report, where a group of thought leaders, economists, and policymakers are asked what they think the most important threats to human well-being are. And what you can see is these environmental threats are increasingly included, and I think the top 5 risks in 2020 were all environmental risks. And in particular, one of those is biodiversity loss. And so the impact of biodiversity loss, not just on the biodiversity itself, but as a risk to our own well-being, is increasingly highlighted both by economists and global leaders. And that's in the context of things like Sophie mentioned about ecological footprint, where we have effectively exceeded the capacity of the world to support our consumption since about 1970, which is when the Living Planet report, Living Planet Index, begins to measure vertebrate populations from. And that footprint is geographically biased. It's massively biased towards developed Western countries, which have a much larger impact per person than developing countries. And it affects the distribution of land that we use, where we increasingly consume the available land of the earth with pasture, cropland, forests, plantations, and infrastructure. And so the last chapter of the Living Planet report tried to ask the question about what's the future going to look like under different potential scenarios. And this idea about bending the curve of biodiversity loss partly stems from some thinking we did a couple of years ago, where we looked at the different targets that we had set ourselves as a global community to either slow down or prevent continued biodiversity loss, and how it looked like we were going to continue to miss them. And in fact, that's what this year has reported in Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, that we've missed all of the targets that we set ourselves in 2010. And so the question becomes, what's the future going to look like? Are we going to continue with business as usual? And what would biodiversity look like in that instance? Or are there things that we can do? Are there undertakings we can undertake where we'll see biodiversity begin to recover? And so what we did is we joined part of a large collaborative effort run out of IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria, where they took the different socioeconomic pathways. So these are around the different thinking for the IPCC, what the future might look like in order for us to mitigate the impacts of climate change. So some of these assume business as usual, where we don't do much. Others are these middle of the road scenarios, which assumes things like a cap in world populations of humans at about 9.4 billion, and a variety of different mitigation measures. And for each of those different scenarios, you can imagine a future map of the world where these particular parts of the world have plantations, these have infrastructure, these have protected areas. But those models to date were largely focused purely on mitigating carbon. And what we did as part of this collaborative effort was ask the question about how does biodiversity loss, how is it impacted by those different choices? And there are many different ways you can do this. And so what David Leclerc, who led this work, did was take a variety of different models of that future and put them all together. And the different scenarios that we explored for the impacts of biodiversity of the future were these. The first was a baseline, which is this kind of middle of the road. So this is not a worst case scenario. It's just sort of a business as usual scenario. Another is to increase conservation efforts, which assumes that we'll better protect parts of the world. There'll be increased conservation efforts on species. Another is where we move towards more sustainable productions, which is called the supply side efforts. Another is where we change how we consume food and other resources. And then there are combinations of these where we both conserve species better, but also increase our sustainable production. That should be a C, sorry, where we conserve species better, but change the way we consume things. And then the integrated action portfolio assumes all three of those, where we both protect, change the way we consume, and change the way we produce. And what was striking about this analysis, and bear in mind this is a complicated graph, is that only in that last scenario, where we both better conserve the species and the landscapes we care about, but also change the way we produce and consume resources, were we able to see biodiversity recover by 2100. And so the only scenario that really met the CBD's vision was the integrated action portfolio, which suggests that we need not just to better conserve land and species, but also to change the way we consume food and produce food. And that was true for a whole variety of different indicators. So the LPI is just one of the indicators in this large collaborative effort. It's also true of the extent of suitable habitat for species, various different mean species abundance, and biodiversity intactness. Across all of these different indicators, it was only really in this integrated action portfolio that we saw this curve begin to bend in the way that we'd like it to. And so this cartoon just kind of highlights that, which is that unless we as a community and as an international community begin to change the way we produce, consume, and protect wildlife, that's the only scenario in which we'll see it begin to recover in the way we might want. And I guess what I'd like to highlight is that the LPI, which we produce at ZSL, is a kind of an integral part of this in understanding what vertebrate populations look like in the future and beginning to understand how we might look at the threats and mitigate those for future conservation work. There's lots of information available online. You can go both to the Living Planet Index website, but also to a new stats website that we have. And I think Charlotte and Ellie are passing those links around. And also you can download the report at the WF's website. So it just remains for me to thank both Louise and Soph, but also to other members of the Indicators and Assessments Unit who helped with the report, Stephanie, Valentina, Monica, and Kate, but also the Indicators and Assessments Unit, which have made this report possible, and ZSL and WF for their help in producing it. Thanks, everyone.